This is your PowerPoint module for the new test taking skills for the new AP test under the framework that is being given now. So first off, some changes in AP testing. In some ways, the old test really is not all that different from the new test. In this sense, the way we used to teach the class in the old test was still based upon historical thinking skills and themes. And on top of that, our multiple choice questions were about relationships and distractors. So for example, one of the questions on the old test was the concept of Republican motherhood, which historians have used to describe the roles of women in the early 19th century, described. Students would have to go through this. They would have to understand what Republican motherhood was, and then they would have to go and try and figure out what was being asked for here that they could get rid of distractors for. So the answer here on this particular one was to get rid of A, the importance of women working in local decision making. That's much more of something that would have been done in the 20th century. Get rid of C, the expectation of women's maternal roles would lead into reform. In many ways that it's close, but it would have much more to do with like the cult of domesticity or maybe even the fight for suffrage. Sometimes that was used as an argument for suffrage. D, centrality of women in religious revivals. That really had much more to do with the Second Great Awakening. And E, the presumption that women would enter the labor force after having children, which had to do with the fight between cult of domesticity and the second wave of feminism in the 1950s and 1960s. So eventually they should get down to B, the idea that mothers were responsible for distilling citizenship virtues. So the way we used to teach this was for students to do process of elimination. Get rid of the answers that didn't work. These were the distractors. Go for the one that did work. And that was pretty much where you had to go to. Here's what the new testing questions are going to look like. There are now 19 sections with primary, secondary, or graphic sources. They call these the stimulus. After the stimulus, there are about 3 to 4 multiple choice questions about the selection, and the questions are based upon the historical thinking skills, change over time, comparison and contrast, and synthesis. So, what I like to teach to my students are speed reading skills. Now, I know this might sound a little strange. You might be thinking, well, what does this really have to do with history? But actually, speed reading skills really help students out in order to narrow down and filter out distractors to get down to what they really need to do. So the first thing I have them do is they need to quickly skim over the questions after the stimulus in order to see what types of historical themes and skills they're going to be asked about. The second thing I want them to do is to look to the source, the author, and the date for context. And in AP US History, this works out really well because so many times the authors are very familiar to the students. And the reason why is that so many of the authors that are here are major presidents, major activists, major leaders that we've talked about in class. If they can see who that author is, it gives them a lot to decode. Also, the date for the context can work out well. You know, if they get a reading that's from the 1890s, they know this is about either industrialization or about American foreign policy. The third thing I want them to do is now go to the text itself and scan the reading for what we call the gist of the reading. A lot of students will read over a reading, they'll go over every date and every number and every event. We don't want them to do that. They need to read over for the overall idea of the reading. And then I want them to underline key terms in the question, eliminate distractors, and choose the best answer of the two possibilities. Notice this is very similar to what we used to do with the old test. So let's go through one of these. This was on one of the old tests. And let's take a look at how this would work. Now, one thing I want you to notice, it does make the test a little bit easier. We have moved now from having the typical A, B, C, D, and E choices to now A through D choices, which makes it a little bit easier for the students. So again, what would they do here? First thing they want to do is go to the reading. Tell them don't do that. Go to the questions themselves. And if you go to the question, the first one is, which of the following actions by the Clinton administration best reflects the ideas about the scope of government expressed in the excerpt? So what we want them to do here is to be able to see what the historical thinking skill that's being asked for. And in many ways, this is sort of a synthesis type of question in which the Clinton administration's ideas are being synthesized into what they were eventually going to implement. So the next thing we want to do is see the ideas expressed by Clinton in the excerpt were most similar to which of the 20th century presidents. So again, synthesis skill. Who would have fit into his ideas? Now, hopefully what they will get very quickly by looking at the author and the date is knowing that Bill Clinton in 1996 supported things like free trade for NAFTA, but at the same time was trying to find a middle ground with the Reagan Revolution. So once they have that, now they can go into the reading, and as they read through this, what they're going to see is that this is Bill Clinton's argument about the era of big government being over. But they should be able to get that Bill Clinton is making an argument here to incorporate Reagan's argument and really to argue for what he called the third way politics. Now, This is pretty sophisticated stuff, and maybe your students won't be able to get this. You're probably teaching this near the end of the year. It's probably something you have to go over pretty quickly. But what they should be able to get out of this, and from what you probably have taught about in class, is that Bill Clinton was advocating for a shrinking of government, but still allowing for government to do things in the economy. So now let's go back to question 54. Which one of these fits? Well, they can easily get rid of A. A has to do with foreign policy. It's not about domestic policy. So the decision to pursue military peacekeeping in the Balkans and Somalia, true to what was happening with Clinton, but that's foreign policy. They should be able to get rid of that. We're going to skip B for a minute. You'll see why. Let's go to C, the negotiation of new free trade agreements. Well, this is probably something you teach about with NAFTA, but they should be able to see, again, foreign policy, not domestic. And then D, the effort to enact universal health care legislation. Students might get tripped up by this a little bit, but they probably are going to be able to read and gather that the idea that the government would expand to universal health care just doesn't fit with the reading. So that's why we're able to get back to B. Just eliminating A, C, and D, we really don't even need to know B very specifically because we can eliminate all the other answers. But we do know that B is correct. This was Bill Clinton's welfare reform agreement with the Republicans in order to try and win over that third way politics of showing the government could decrease in its scope while at the same time providing for some supports to the poor. So now we go over to number 55. Number 55, which one does this fit with the most? Well, if we go to this Lyndon Johnson expanded government, he's out. We're going to skip B for a second and go to Franklin Roosevelt. He expanded government. He's out. Woodrow Wilson is a progressive, expanded government. He's out. So now we're down to B, Ronald Reagan, who wanted to see a limitation on government. It's a clear answer for them to connect that up to Bill Clinton's argument. So a clear carryover into this is the short answer section, very similar to multiple choice section. Students are going to get 4 separate stimulus sections. They could be primary, secondary, or graphic sources. There's going to be one question for each, but it's broken into 2 to 3 parts. Now, there's a typical pattern that I've noticed to most of these questions. Not always, so you don't want to tell your students to approach this as a rule, but there is a typical pattern that pops up again and again, and it is to analyze the point of view of the stimulus, provide some kind of supporting evidence, and then provide some kind of contrasting evidence. So the strategy that I would offer is this. Tell students they really need to keep their answers brief and short. They have a very short time to answer all of these arguments. They don't need to go into depth. They can't go into depth, as you're going to find out in just a second. The strategy is to provide a brief 2 to 3 sentence argument that answers the historical thinking skill that's being asked, and they need to do that concisely. So let's take a look at one of the examples here. John Muir makes the statement, "None of nature's landscapes are ugly so long as they are wild." Then we have former President Theodore Roosevelt. "I recognize the right and duty of this generation to develop and use natural resources of our land, but I do not recognize the right to waste them or to rob by wasteful use the generations that come after us." So when we look to the questions that are going to be asked of them, it's very similar to the pattern that we talked about. A, briefly explain one implication for public policy of John Muir's view on land use. Clear-cut answer for them, and the historical thinking skill is really an argumentative skill in which they're providing an example, would be to say that John Muir believed in preservation and the need to respect the inherent beauty of nature. Simply offering that as a one-sentence argument is going to get them the point for A. B, briefly explain one way in which an implication for public policy of Theodore Roosevelt's view contrasts with the implication for public policy of John Muir's view. A lot of choices that you can make off of this, but one of the ones that comes to mind for me would be the use of Hetch Hetchy Valley, in which Theodore Roosevelt's viewpoint differed with John Muir's viewpoint, his support during the Taft administration of having a small section of a national forest being developed. Now, what's important is that the students need to make sure that they make that contrast, though. Notice that what the question asks is, how did the Theodore Roosevelt's view contrast with the implication of John Muir's view? They need to explain that, which means they need to give a reason, or what we call added value. What's so important throughout this entire year as you teach this class is to constantly press the students. They can't just give an answer. They've got to explain why, what's the added value, elaborate on giving some kind of reason behind their argument. And then C, identify one specific example of land use policy in the United States from 1890 to 1945. Briefly explain how the example is consistent with the view of either Muir or Roosevelt. There's a lot of things you could choose from. One of the ones that comes to mind for me that a student could do is Roosevelt's support for the increased use of national forests because it was a way to conserve the past with natural resources while still allowing for people and businesses to use natural resources in a conservationist way. Now notice again, what's really important, don't just have them give the example, make sure they give the explanation because that's what the question is asking for. So what's important here is they've got to make sure they give the example and give the reason. So some short answer rules. First, the students are going to be given a box to write their answers in. They must stay in that box. Students will want to go outside of the box. They're going to want to write around the box. They're going to want to try and write two lines within lines. To tell them stop doing that. They need to write clearly in the box and stay in the box so that the readers can grade it. Second thing, I would highly suggest that students label their answers A, B, and C. Now, I've had some debates about this with teachers. Here's why I think it's so important. A, B, and C will make it very clear for the readers on what is being answered. Now, the big thing that a lot of people will bring up is what if the student makes a mistake and they go out of order and they end up labeling something A but answering B, or labeling something B and answering A. The readers want to give your students points, trust me. And so they're going to read for where the correct answer is. By labeling things A, B, and C, you make it clear for the reader what's being argued. And if a student should make that mistake that we talked about, the reader will find where the right answer is. Remind the students as well that they need to write briefly because they are under very strict time limits. But what the students must hit is a historical thinking skill. And this is why it's so important when they're writing these answers, not just to provide an example, not to provide a superficial or general example. They've got to provide that added value. They've got to provide that thinking skill. So, some takeaways. Remind the student they're not looking for the right answer, but the best possible answer. Students get very hung up on when they are going for these answers to look for the right answer, and by doing that, they don't get rid of distractors. It's very important that they understand that a lot of these answers are true to history, but they're looking for the best possible answer for the question that's being asked. Historical thinking skills and themes are the most important throughout the entire test. Whenever they read a question, they've got to ask, what is the skill and what is the theme that they're being tested on? The students need to use context to decode readings and eliminate distractors. This is why I teach the students throughout the year. It's so important. Don't go directly to the text. Ask who's the author, who's the date, and what's going on around that time period. Short answers are about direct and concise answers using the skills and themes.